My name is Dave White, and I'm the PI and co-director for Decision Center for Desert City. And I'd like to welcome you to our inaugural water climate briefing for this academic year. It's great to see so many folks attend. We had something like 75 RSVPs for this event, and so it's really encouraging. And I think that that's probably a reflection of our outstanding panel that we have. So I'd like to begin and just kind of give you, since it's the first time I've seen many of you in a couple months, I'd like to give you a little update on some of the recent accomplishments from the center and the participants. The most important is that since we've last seen many of you, DCDC completed a major milestone in that we had a successful midterm site review by the National Science Foundation. So NSF provided a review with an external committee of advisors, and DCDC emerged from that successfully, and the committee said, I just want to read you a quote, that DCDC has developed an extensive and high-quality program that combines new research on social science elements of decision-making under uncertainty with direct stakeholder involvement. The programs have a well-defined vision and mission, and the research carried out under DCDC is consistent with its mission. The group has developed a tool of considerable value to practitioners and educators alike in WaterSim. And the group has developed high-quality education and outreach programs and is highly adaptive, responsive to critiques and suggestions of past reviews. And I share that with you just as a way of thanking the DCDC faculty, staff, and graduate students, and also our stakeholder and community partners, because it's really the work that you all have done that contributes to the success of the organization. We really appreciate that, those contributions. And many of you in this room are the reason that we've been successful in that regard. So today we're going to kick off our series for the year, and we're going to start with the discussion of the idea of challenges of communicating sustainability in complex systems for public policy. And this is the topic that we will be exploring in depth throughout a series of 6 to 9 of these meetings this academic year. And we're starting off with a panel that includes Jonathan Capel, who is the Dean of the College of Public Programs, and also the Laddie and Elvacor Presidential Chair from the School of Public Affairs at ASU. And Jonathan is also my dean, and that's for my boss's boss. Right? Next, we also have Michael Schoon. Michael is Assistant Professor in Environmental Policy in the School of Sustainability here at ASU, and also works with a group focused on complex adaptive systems, which you'll hear about today. And third, we have Doug Toy, and Doug is the Water Regulatory Affairs Manager for the City of Chandler, and Doug has been one of our regular collaborators and partners on a variety of projects here at DCDC. And so the format of the panel today is just going to be, we're going to have some initial comments where I've asked the panelists to tell you a little bit about themselves, a little bit about the work that they've done in their respective area of expertise, and then address a couple key questions in terms of what are the major insights, what are the major findings from either their field of academic research or from their experience as a practitioner in facing the challenge of complexity and issues related to sustainability, and how we communicate those issues to public policy and other decision makers for incorporation into their decision making, and also how those communities, decision makers and public policy representatives, communicate the complexity and issues that they deal with to the academy so that we can incorporate those into our research. So what are the big challenges that we face in dealing with complexity and communicating that? And then in the second part of the talk, we'll address new and innovative approaches for communicating complexity in systems for public policy. And so I'm going to start by asking Michael Schoon to summarize his expertise and experience. Once we go through the panel, each having about 7-10 minutes to talk individually, I'll open it up for questions, and we'd like to hear from many of you in terms of your experiences facing these challenges, and then we'll do a second round of questions and then more discussions. Okay? So once again, thank you everyone for coming, and I'd like to introduce Michael Schoon.
Hi everybody. My research is in complexity and sustainability and resilience, predominantly through environmental policy and looking at the appropriation of natural resources and how do we manage that appropriation, as well as the provision of public goods. talking about complexity and sustainability and communicating that, the first thing that struck me is that I hope that I'm not demonstrating how not to do it, because it's a bit of a daunting task. So bear with me, please.
That could have been your big reveal at the end.
Yeah, right. So now that you've seen how I do it, please listen to what I say, not what I do. So I thought we'd start more about me, or do you want me to talk about?
Okay, why don't you start a little bit with your background and then move in?
Sure. So I focus on institutional analysis and see myself as a social ecological scientist rather than as a political scientist or something else. And I'll bring this up again and again, the idea of interdisciplinarity and what that means for complexity and what that means for sustainability and the issues that we're confronting and trying to solve as scientists. So I thought first talking about a few different ways that I see people using the word complexity and how it's being used here at ASU. One way is in common parlance, this is really complex, and using it as a metaphor for something that's a big challenge, a big problem, as the first way. The second is this is a new methodological approach or set of methodological approaches to these challenges that we're facing using computation and modeling approaches to science. And the third, and the one that I'd like to focus on a little bit more, is this holistic approach to science. This draws on the other two definitions of complexity, but this holistic approach, an interdisciplinary approach to the major challenges confronting us as society, and some of the big challenges are that we're looking at systems, complex adaptive systems, where there's no silver bullets. There's a lot of wicked problems, if we're familiar with that terminology, where there's no simple solution. There's different points of view, different worldviews of the problems, and we're trying to make sense of that in systems where there are nonlinearities, where the system doesn't just continue to go incrementally, but we're trying to struggle with and comprehend these nonlinearities and thresholds where things radically change in a moment's notice, and we're trying to deal with what happens now that the system is the way it is. So if we think about things like climate change, for instance, if we're approaching thresholds, how do we know we're approaching a threshold? What happens once we cross that threshold? And how do we go about studying this and understanding this and moving from a reductionist approach to science to this more holistic view and trying to understand that?
I was going to ask if you could just give some, so you mentioned climate change. What are some other examples of these kinds of wicked problems that have been discussed in the literature where complexity is a major component of the problem?
So anytime we bring the economy into the equation, it seems that we're adding a layer of complexity. And what happens, how do we respond with multiple stakeholder groups, including corporations and businesses and politicians and other stakeholder groups in civil society. And as these groups interact and bring their different mental models of what's going on, we start to have problems with bringing them all together, creating a coherent vision going forward.
And another question I had in preparing for this was, this is a new and emerging field of interdisciplinary study, and ASU has positioned itself well as contributing to the leading edge of this field. What do you think are the single most important insights or conclusions, if you will, from this field of study thus far? If the study of complex adaptive systems had to give its little elevator speech, what have we learned? What is this area contributed to our understanding of these wicked problems?
So in looking at complex adaptive systems, one of the big things that comes out is how microbehavior, how a group of actors, whether they're people or animals or organizations and corporations, how the microbehavior is leading to different macro or aggregate behavior than what we might have expected. So in complexity, we often talk about emergence or emergent behavior, and this is what we're seeing, and we see this in models, in case studies when we go back and look at what happened in hindsight. So I think something around
summary. And also, so if you could summarize what you thought were the biggest outstanding or most provocative questions facing this field of study, what are the things that are the leading edge of the science in this domain?
So let me mention two things. One is some of the work that's being done at ASU on complex adaptive systems and CAS at ASU, which came out of CASI. CASI is the Consortium for Biosocial Complex Systems, which is comprised of 3 member centers on campus who are doing work on various aspects of the field. CSID, Marco's representing here. Center for the Study of Institutional Diversity, and that's where I can talk about some of my personal work. CSDC, Center for Social Dynamics and Complexity, and then the Mathematical and Computational Modeling Center as well. And then there's other centers like the Center for Policy Informatics that are doing related work.
Yeah, and that's several of those different projects are groups that DCDC has interacted with in various ways. One final question before we move on to Doug, and that's what, in reporting the results or communicating the results or insights that you've developed within this field from any of these projects, what do you find are the greatest challenges in communicating those results in a way that would be meaningful for decision making or policy making within the environmental governance realm?
So I think some of the big challenges that we have in communicating this is that we live in a world that we're all quite familiar with, where people want to hear sound bites, they want to hear the quick answer, and as scientists we end up doing a lot of these studies, and we come up with an answer that says it depends. And to move beyond the it depends, we have a however long your spiel is, 15 minutes, 15 hours, 15 weeks for a semester, I'm not sure, but it's all elaborated on this it depends answer, and I think that's one of the challenges that we have in communicating the complexity and getting people to understand things like nonlinearities and thresholds, when I think our brains seem to be adapted to not think that way.
Thank you. We're going to have one round of questions, and then we'll open it up for the audience, and I'd like to hear your questions for any of the panelists. So now I'd like to ask Doug to talk just a little bit first about your roles and responsibilities within the city of Chandler, and then from your perspective, what are the major challenges that are faced by your agency and other water management agencies as they try to deal with complexity in decision making?
Well, I've been with the city of Chandler for over 13 years. I started out pretty much as the engineer helping out, and moved up to water policy advising, and I guess either I did a good job at that or they didn't like me, so they gave me the rest of the regulatory water quality, wastewater quality programs to deal with. And then,
The second part, so just some examples of complexity in your organization. What are the most complex, most challenging issues that you face and deal with in your organization?
well, you know, let me back up a bit.
Sure.
And start with what I see as kind of our jobs here. And I work for the utilities department, and so we deliver water, clean up wastewater, deliver reclaimed water. And when you step back and think about, well, what is our purpose at Chandler? And I look at that as we supply water as a tool so that our decision makers, our council, can bring what we think is a quality of life to our citizens. So when you look at that, and you look at water as more of a strategic resource, so we're trying to maximize that use. And I think when you get into it, you find out that, well, there's a lot of interrelated issues that come with water. And what I tell my boss, and when I go up and brief the manager's office, they kind of don't like what I say, but I said, hey, everything is related to everything. So you can't take this issue and isolate it. And I think some of the problem that
That's a good definition of complexity.
that we're dealing with is when I first saw the flyer come out here, I said, oh, this is great. I'm going to go to this seminar because I want to learn. Then I get a call from David's office saying, hey, David, would you like to be on the channel? And I said, why? I want to be in the audience. I want to be, tell me how to talk to people. And when I was thinking about this is we have very much interrelated, complex systems that are nonlinear. So how do you take the nonlinear complex risk management, which is not black or white, it's gray. You got this gray area that goes from black to white, so where do you want to be? And you ultimately bring it up to the decision makers, and this is not unique to the councils, it's to all of us, to Congress. We make binary decisions, yes or no. Am I going to buy the car, yes or no? Am I going to move to this house, yes or no? Am I going to vote for this water issue, yes or no? So we take these very complex, nonlinear issues and we bring them down to a binary decision. And then what happens is on the other side as a practitioner, so you make the binary decision and there's some risk. Let's say there's a 1% chance that something bad's going to happen, and to eliminate that 1% chance is going to cost a lot of money. Okay, so take it up to council, and council says, okay, well, we're not paying lots of money for that 1% chance. No. Okay, next year the 1% chance hits. Where am I? I'm probably out looking for another job. I mean, because you can't, it's very difficult to go back and say, well, no, look, you made, the decision was a 1% chance, and that's kind of like 1% chance every year. So, since we had this, do you still want to move forward with this, or do we want to have a fire drill, and now we start looking at alternatives to fix whatever bad had happened? And that's, as a practitioner, I think that's some of the difficult issues we face, is taking all these nonlinear, complex, interrelated issues and bringing them down to a yes or no.
That's a really important insight, I think, and something that must be quite challenging when you understand the complexities and the interdependencies, and then you're trying to frame up and present these issues in ways that allow your council or other decision makers to choose a discrete option, right? To make a single vote. What kind of challenges do you face in doing that? Like, how do you struggle with that issue?
Well, I think a good example that we're working through right now is the use of reclaimed water. And I guess one of the concerns we have is, well, where should it be used? Should you use it inside the house? And I think the interrelated issues is, well, yeah, if you use it inside your house and use it inside your business, you get star leads credits, so that you get all these credits, and that's good. Okay, you're saving water. That's good, but you're saving water on a very micro level. So if you look at it and you look at a bigger system, is okay. So you're saving water at this part of the town. It's got pretty good sized pipes, and it was designed to move water to you. And we've got this EPA regulations called TTHMs, and if you let the water sit in the pipe too long, TTHMs form, and now you're out of compliance. And when our department's out of compliance, my boss goes bananas, and I'm in the office listening to him go bananas, so then we go back and we try to fix it. So how do we rectify the problem of, if we serve reclaimed water to certain areas that's already piped and we're saving water? Before we go out and take the sample, we go out and we open up the fire hydrants and we flush. We take all that water that's in the pipe, flush it on the street, and hopefully it goes to some drain that doesn't cause problems other places. But I mean, those are the kind of issues. So did you save any water? I would argue, nope. So then we're looking at bringing this issue up along with some other issues on reclaimed water before the council and say, should we prohibit reclaimed water on residential properties? We recently did a survey and we found 3% non-compliance with the houses that we had that were using reclaimed water. in terms of the public water system, that's protected because we got a backflow assembly in front of their house. We're happy as the public water system. The homeowner doesn't realize that, well, geez, that backflow preventer keeps, for me, whenever I do something stupid in my house, my family's at risk, but the rest of my neighbors are not. So that's you know, one of the issues we're looking at there is, well, how far do we regulate? I mean, do we go out there and should we regulate the houses? Should we prohibit it this? Are we getting any water? What is the risk to the homeowner? And I can tell you this, that since I've been there, we have had 2 instances where we've gotten complaints about bad tasting water. We go in there and we find out, hey, guess what? Somebody cross-circuited your house. Your reclaim that you're using for irrigation is now into your potable water, so it's your tap water.
So we do have direct potable reuse here. Well, I thank you, Doug. And Doug brings up many of the, I think, practical examples of these ideas of complexity and the interdependencies and interconnections of these systems that we talk about in the university. And you're talking about essentially, you know, you've got public attitudes and opinions, you've got regulatory concerns, you have perceptions of risk, and so there are a variety of these interconnected things that you're dealing with. So let's move on. If Jonathan, if you could talk a little bit about your background, and then again, as I discussed with Michael, what are the kind of key insights from academic research on the administration of complex organizations that you could describe, and then anything else you'd like?
Yeah, I'll just randomly go around. So the first thing we do is reveal a secret. The secret is that Dave, very unassuming guy in his khakis and shirt, you know, he doesn't look like it. He's a rock star in disguise. And so I want to recognize that. I mean, I think DCDC in itself, and Dave is really, I think, pushed in this direction, and he'll say, no, it's the team of people, and I recognize that. But he wants the center itself to be at this nexus that he's focusing this discussion on, and I think has done a really admirable job of connecting the academic with the practical and trying to maintain a focus on that. So I think we're really, we ASU are really lucky to have Dave as part of the institution, and I'm very delighted to have him as a faculty member in the College of Public Programs. I'll give a very quick pitch for the college and relate it to the thing, because I think it does have to do with how everything is connected to everything else. So the College of Public Programs is downtown at Phoenix, and it comprises of 4 academic units. The School of Community Resources Development, which Dave is a faculty member in, which also includes Parks and Recreation, Tourism Development, and the Nonprofit Leadership Management Program. School of Public Affairs, which does public administration, public policy, public management, that sort of thing. A lot of Doug's colleagues have MPAs, and Doug just told me his daughter's getting an MPA. So a good portion of the population of Arizona are living in municipalities that are governed by people with degrees from ASU. It's really interesting public good that the university produces. It also includes the School of Criminology and the School of Social Work, which you might think are not related to this topic, but I would argue they are, because the behavioral dimension of the complexity is, I think, an often overlooked one, and it relates to sort of these sort of micro behaviors that lead to unexpected outcomes, and how policy changes can lead to unintended consequences, right? If you save water by getting rid of parks or recreational facilities, that may have social consequences that are unintended. So that's a quick view of the academic programs. We also have a set of research centers that plug into this in many ways. You made reference to the Center for Policy Informatics, one of our centers, and I could go on and on. The Morrison Institute is part of the college, has done a great deal on water, of course, and so we have a lot of different things here. I don't want to drone on about it because I know we want to talk about the substance. This question of communicating about complexity and the ways in which we participate in public policy dialogue is not confined, obviously, to the area of sustainability. It's a sort of huge issue, and it's one that I think is one of the great tensions in a democracy, and it's particularly acute at this moment, because you have a frustration from many people in the population that there's no public voice in deliberation, right? You hear this all the time. It has various manifestations. It's all about money. It happens behind closed doors, not transparent, which is ironic because we probably live in a time when there's more transparency and more accessibility to information than we've ever had before. And so something is missing in terms of the way in which we manage that interface and the way in which the public participates. And so I mention this as a broad problem because it's something that in our college, I think we're devoting more attention to than most people in the realm of public affairs nationally. So in the School of Public Affairs, we have something called the Participatory Governance Initiative, which is all about designing systems, and I'll come back to this in a second, designing systems by which people can participate in governance. And this is actually a global phenomenon. So in many parts of the world now, municipalities are required to have a participatory budgeting exercise where citizens actually play a role in the budgeting process. This is now required in the UK, for example. It's increasingly getting adopted in the United States. If it sounds sort of like this New England town hall kind of thing, it is. If you've ever seen a video of one of these things, it's amazing that it's able to work. But you have more of these things that are emerging, citizen juries, citizen panels that are evaluating ballot propositions. There are lots of different forms of these emerging. Similarly, actually, associated with the School of Community Resource Development, we have a partnership for Community Development Center, which is also looking at these interactions between decision makers and the citizenry in the communities who are concerned about outcomes. There's no easy way to make it work. I think the model that we're most familiar with when you say community participation is the town meeting where there's a microphone sitting there and then there's a bunch of city councilmen. Now we know John McCain sits there playing with his phone. But seriously, if you ever have gone to one of these things or gone to one of these hearings, you can understand why everybody whips out their phone, right? Because it's generally a sequence of people getting up and screaming at a panel of counselors or supervisors. That's not participation, it's not dialogue. There's no communication about complexity or anything like that. And we'll come back to this, I'm sure. I would put it to you that there's no reward for trying to communicate complexity because people want the dichotomous black and white, and if you try to give the complexity, you're crucified for it. And it only is going to be used to create a gotcha later on. So the thing that's funny, you said, well, how does this relate to your research? And I'll talk about that in a second. But the thing that I'm mostly thinking about as germane to this is something that I remember when I was a grad student and I was a TA for the professor teaching the PS1 Intro to American Politics, and he said, the thing you have to remember about understanding politics or understanding government is that politics is a sideshow in the circle of life, right? For most people, they're focused on the football, they're focused on getting their kids to the doctor, what's in school, am I gonna make it to open, who's making dinner, who's picking up the kids, right? This is life, you all live this life, right? And so the idea that you have a lot of time to focus on, well, what are the implications of the water policy? And I haven't thought about the water flow and how is that going to affect the pipe. And we have an infrastructure that's built for more water use and now the pipes are smaller and, oh my God, I mean, that's not how people, they don't have time for that, right? They tell me what the right thing to do is, right? I mean, at some level, that's what people want. And so we want to have a process which allows for citizen engagement and communication, and yet the bandwidth, there's literal bandwidth, but I'm talking about the mental bandwidth of the vast majority of citizens to engage these questions is extremely limited. And so I think part of the challenge, and I think Doug got this, and I was thinking about it as he was talking, part of the challenge is creating means of communicating complexity that create clarity without false simplicity, right? So I think when we often take situations of complexity, and I've seen this with environmental questions, it's simplified to something. And I mean the sort of the mother lode of this simplification, which is really problematic, is we started talking about global warming, and this is really frustrating. Global warming. It's snowing. How could there be global warming? Just that simplification of global warming as opposed to climate change. Well, that has caused all kinds of problems. Did the people who put forward the supposition about climate changing know that it could go up? Yes, sure they did. But it was simplifying, right? It's getting warmer. Now we're stuck in this simplified heuristic and we're having a hard time breaking it out. So I think that's one thing that I think we should be talking about, which is how do you get clarity without destructive simplification that leads to people being disappointed when things don't work out the way they said. The second part is I'll add my own layer of complexity, which I'm interested in, which is the complexity of the institutions and the processes that we've created to deal with these things. Right? So the science is bad enough, right? That's a nightmare, right? That no matter what you do, you seem to poke yourself in the eye. But then the problem is that the institutions that we have to deal with these complex problems are themselves complex and introduce a whole bunch of pathologies that have to be dealt with and keep us from maybe creating what we might even agree is a scientifically optimal outcome, if we can agree on it. Right? So, by the way, I would add one element of definitional nuance to complexity, which is I think that one thing that makes a complex problem complex is that you have people who are optimizing on different values, and you can't agree on what the value optimization is. And so the reason there's no right answer is because we start from different premises. But so then you try and push that through this meat grinder, which we all know is highly dysfunctional and creates all kinds of pathology, some of them on purpose, right? Separation of powers, schoolhouse rock, right? All that. And it becomes, hey, all life was explained in schoolhouse rock. It becomes that much more daunting. So just to give what my most recent area of interest was about global governance, and so the sort of transnational institutions that we create to deal with all these things. And the interesting thing, just to tie it to sustainability, so I looked at about 25 different organizations that each in their own way create different kinds of rules and standards, everything from international aviation to the standards organizations to banking and so on and so forth. And one of the areas where we don't is climate change, right? And part of the reason we don't, I would argue, is that we didn't accept one of the things that's really frustrating. In any of these global systems, they are inherently unfair, and I'm not going to give my talk on this. But if you think about it, they are unfair in the sense that they are biased towards giving powerful interests more say than less powerful interests. That's just inherent to it. And if you believe that you want a global rule-making system, you accept that unfairness and you move along. And you find this compromise, and I could get into this at some length, but I want to adhere. In the realm of climate change, and we can agree or disagree on whether it's the right thing, the world basically wasn't willing to say that a system would give veto rights to the United States and China. It's more or less what it came down to. Now that might have been the right thing or not, but we don't have a system because people weren't willing to make that concession. We could have had a system that would have been inherently unfair. Would that have created pathologies down the line that we would have been unhappy with? Quite probably, and so maybe it was the right thing to say, screw it, we'd rather have no system than this inherently flawed system. The reality is most of the systems we have for dealing with the problems that are, whether it's water or electricity or pollution, whatever, they exist within an inherently flawed system, which was in some sense hardwired to be bad at dealing with complexity. And so that would I would argue, that from my point of view, that's what I'm interested in, which is how do you then, given that reality, try to find solutions and work them through that layer. So I've talked enough.
That's great, thank you. And I think one of the things, it's a great place to take a pause and go to the audience, because one of the things we've now illustrated is from the science side of socio-ecological systems and complex adaptive systems, we're creating new knowledge about how these systems interact and the properties that they exhibit. You mentioned emergence as one of those critical properties. And then from both practitioner experience and academic research, we've learned that there is a level of complexity within the institutions themselves and the governance of those institutions. So now what we're tasked with is the challenge of connecting these two systems of complexity, or multiple different systems that each have their own complexities and pathologies. And so what I'd like to do now is turn to the audience and ask for either comments. For instance, Marco, if you wanted to share any insights about complex systems from your own research, or I saw Gary here early. Gary, if you wanted to comment about the complexity of dealing with an organization like Intel, or where's Dale? Dale Larson, who ran the City of Phoenix Parks and Recreation Department for many years. If you wanted to comment about complexity within organizations and or questions that address any of these topics, with the focus in this first part on what are the big challenges that we face right now. And then we'll move on in the second part of the discussion to what are potential solutions to these issues. So I'll just open it up. Yeah, Paul?
So maybe, Doug, if you could...
Oh, and if I could say, would you mind just saying your name real quickly when you ask your question?
So Paul Westroff from engineering. So Doug, how do you go about telling the same story to different groups? So on one hand, you said you want to tell people to use less water, but it sounded like you also wanted the city to have a certain quality of life, so you want to tell Intel and other companies that you have plenty of water to come here and do business. So how do you kind of match those two, saying we don't have enough water, use less, and come here, we have plenty of water?
When we look at our policies, we actually have a long discussion about that. So how do you tell people there's enough water here, but then how do you tell them, well, don't waste? And then I think we took a page out of SRP's power side, and we come back and say we have plenty of water, but not enough waste. So that's what we try to do, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, is we try to move things into small sound bites so that people can understand it. I mean, I don't, you know, we have this problem of how do you also bring equity into this. So people that are moving in, and if you have to go out and acquire additional water supply through they moving in, you know, how do you convey that to them, or how do you convey it to our public? You know, I don't know. I don't know how you convey block rates, because within block rates you have a certain amount of water that's cheap, and then a certain amount of water, and it gets more expensive. And the idea is, as it got more expensive, you paid more. And with that, it was supposed to be price sensitive, and if you paid too much, you would reduce your water. But embedded in that public policy is the people that are paying a lot for that top rate are subsidizing the people that are paying the bottom rate. Now, is that fair? And I don't know.
So I think part of the question and your response relates to what Jonathan said earlier about communicating complexity without oversimplifying it. You know, in some way of framing a message that gets across what you're doing as far as your policy goal, right, and communicates that policy goal, but doesn't simplify it to the point of making it, you know, detrimental or making it harmful in the communication. So that's a real, and that's why I think there's some interesting research going on at ASU and other places about how do we communicate complexity and how do we frame messages. And this has been an area of research within climate change specifically. How do we communicate climate change to people that in a way that gets across the complexity but allows for the fact that they have limited cognitive ability to attend to that issue amidst their other concerns. Thanks. Other questions? I want to go Paul here. And then
Jonathan, quick question for you.
this is Paul Hurt from
Paul Hurt,
History.
School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. Shippers.
I've never heard that used as an acronym. I think I know why.
Our dean told us to change the name. We'll see what we come up with. You said something interesting about how international levels of governing institutions are inherently unequal or unfair, inequitable. And then a little bit later, you also said something really interesting about how institutions of governance, not necessarily at the international level, but all over the place, are hardwired to deal poorly with complexity. I'm wondering if you think that's inherent, or if that's a problem we can solve. Can we hardwire our institutions of governance to deal better with complexity, or is that like the other thing that it's inherent in the system, we have to accept it and move on?
I think so. First of all, I think that they can always be improved, because the systems can be changed, and they do occasionally change. I mean, one of the interesting things about these global systems is that they do evolve over time and to meet different needs. Now, I would argue that most of the international systems that I'm interested in are more fluid than, say, the Constitution of the United States, right? So it's easier to make alterations to them. And when I say that they're hardwired to deal poorly with complexity, that's because I think, this is somewhat grandiose now, but I think most political systems are designed to preserve some distribution of power at a given moment in time, right? Now, they can do it more or less elegantly, and they can do it in such a way that's more or less sustainable over time. So the genius of the American Constitution, and the reason it's lasted longer than any constitutional system, is that there was an incredibly enlightened group of people who said, we're not going to try and win everything with the design of the system. We're going to create something that's relatively accessible for lots of different people, and it gives everybody a chance within this institutional milieu. right? Quite frankly, most global systems are not quite so even-handed. That said, I'm not arguing that the American constitutional system was so even-handed either. It created all kinds of odd things, some of which have gotten really weird over time, right? So we privileged land mass, right? We did that over 200 years ago, right? That's now gotten really problematic, right? I mean, obviously, I think I'm going to assume there's a certain selection bias of people who sit in a room talking about sustainability that you'll agree with me that's really problematic that Wyoming has the same number of votes as California in the United States Senate. And that has huge implications politically, and it makes it hard for us to deal with complexity. You want me to say what I mean about that? Because it gives certain interests more power in the decision-making process. And when certain interests have a certain level of power in the decision-making process, it's harder to get them off of their own self-interested point of view. One of the most interesting things in terms of ASU's work on water has been the demonstration experimentally that you can design processes differently to get people off of their self-interested products. That's cool, right? That the actual process shapes outcomes. Well, but so that's a neat thing to do when you have the experimental ability to change process. In our most governmental systems, not all, we don't have that ability, right? So now you're forced trying to sort of, duct tape and baling wire and stuff, build a system onto that can effectuate the same thing. That's really hard. I mean, and it's not just, and I don't want to focus too much on the design of the federal government. There's all kinds of things. It's not just institutions, even the laws. So the water compact, which governs the use of the Colorado River, creates all kinds of pathological incentives. Right? It's like the saving water. We hurt ourselves by saving water in terms of the way that compact is set up. That's crazy, right? But that's the institutional framework in which we work. So can it be altered? Sure, it can be altered. That'll be your life's work, is trying to alter.
Work days. There are people that we partner with whose life work has been keeping that from being altered.
But that's exactly right. So I think that's what I mean. I don't think it's completely hopeless, but I do think that it's not an even playing field.
Chuck, you had a question then here?
Chuck Redmond, School of Sustainability in DCDC. This is a great discussion, and we've already raised 100 issues. I'm going to go back to framing, because I think one of the difficulties of dealing with complex issues is the framing. And I think, as Doug brought up, most decisions are based on a risk management approach in which you try to make a fail-safe operation. And the problem with complexity is, as we recognize the complexity, the cost of a fail-safe operation is off the chart and no one is willing to pay it. Hence, we knew the problems for Katrina or Fukushima, but no one would pay to have a fail-safe there because it was so unlikely. We need to shift the framing to a safe-to-fail, a more resilient approach to problems that we can, and that would allow us to adjust to complexity. Because as soon as we try and say there's a 0% chance this will fail, we can't be there. It just can't be done, because every day we discover new connections. But if we say, what if, then how can we cope with what if? Coping with what if is probably more addressable in a complexity framework than that.
Doug, would you mind responding to that a little bit in terms of how would that play in talking to your city manager, this sort of a safe-to-fail framing versus risk management, where you're looking at and creating a system that is robust against the highest possible, or the most...
Explain the safe-to-fail concept.
Well, people would argue, and the biggest global failures are Fukushima and deep water drilling in the Gulf and Katrina, all of which were knowable phenomenon, all of which people could have built dikes high enough for, but in the course of decision making didn't, because they were perceived as too expensive. But the real failings in all three cases were the reaction to the failure. In all cases, probably the failures could have been maintained in a much different way, but the whole system was built on a rigidity system that it won't fail. And if we built the world to be more open to those kind of failures, but our responses were effective. If when you note whatever that poor thing in the pipe is, you had a way that cleaned that out easily. A homeowner just turned a valve and something happened, I don't know. And it would cost you to one extra valve, but not to keep the whole world safe from those bacteria or whatever it would be.
Let me try to answer the question. I'm not sure what it is, but we do, you know, in terms of just delivering water, the system that we treat and deliver water, we look at those. We look at our systems and say, okay, what would we do if this failed? What would we do here? What would we do there? And we actually go through the mind exercises, and depending upon how big of a failure, what type of failure, we actually do mock-ups. So we look at that from a very simple, I would say simplified, but really it's a water system delivery. There's pipes in the ground. It's the I guess the risk of unknowns you can mitigate by going through and doing certain things. I find the harder part is getting people to accept a risk of unknown. Because, you know, when working with developers that come in, you know, they're willing to do certain things as long as they know it up front. If you tell them you have to do A, B, C, D, they're fine. They'll walk away grumbling and say, well, you know, D's really expensive, we don't like it, blah, blah, blah. But fine, since you put it there, we'll do it. We know we have to do it. We know the developer down the street is going to have to do that too, so that doesn't give him any competitive advantage. But if we were to switch that model and say, well, you know, we're going to go to this other model, and it's kind of a risk base, you know, kind of a gray. So, you know, maybe you do D, maybe you don't do D. Just depends. It depends, right? So we get to it depends, and that just drives our industries nuts. It also drives our citizens nuts, because if we say, you know, we could pick your garbage up on Wednesday, but it depends, because if we're really busy, we're going to save costs, and, you know, we'll pick it up on Thursday. We would probably get more complaints on that, and you know, on that it depends. But if we could go back and tell the citizens, hey, we could save you, you know, $5 a month on your garbage bill, which could be substantial in terms of relative amount you're paying on your garbage bill, would you live with it? Depends. And I would doubt if anybody would say, no. I want to put my garbage account on Wednesday. I want it picked up on Wednesday so I can pick it in, because I don't like looking at that can in front.
Just as a follow-up, there's a front page article in the New York Times today about what Fukushima is having to do to deal with now the consequences, including pumping, I believe it's liquid nitrogen, to create a frozen layer of ground 200 feet deep to try to keep the groundwater, contaminated groundwater from leaching out into the ocean. The costs are staggering. The Japanese government has taken over now from the utility company.
So I think there are these words that become fads at the moment. So the word of the moment is resilience.
I didn't use it, but that was.
Yeah, so everybody's trying to write resilience into every grant proposal, right? I'm sure we've all done this now, but I do think it's relevant to the. I think it's relevant to not just the framing, but also the thinking about this, because I think that what generally we think about is reducing the probability of failure, right? I think that's how we tend to engineer things. We try to reduce the probability of failure, when it may be smarter to reduce the harm of failure. And I don't think that's generally how we approach these things. And I certainly think in the context of the sort of climate change and the environment, the rising costs of environmental disaster, we are going to have to change our thinking. I mean, New York represents a really interesting thing post Sandy, right? So, all right, so the big plan now, we're going to build a seawall that closes off New York Harbor. I mean, really? I mean, are we? I mean, that's the plan, right? A giant gate in front of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which has probably, I don't know, an 80% chance of stopping, you know, the relevant storm surge. I mean, at the point where you have to close the gate on New York Harbor, things are bad. It seems to me that in that case, moving your generators out of the basements of buildings that are in the flood zone, maybe not having people living on barrier islands that should be underwater, that's probably a better approach. But we tend not to do that. We tend to engineer down the percentage of failure or the likelihood of failure. So I do think that the resilience idea, if properly understood, now I was at a resilience conference where people were using resilience to mean reducing the likelihood of failure. I was like, I think that's not how I understand resilience. The resilience is what happens if everything goes wrong? Are we still able to survive? So it seems to me that for a lot of these things, but that's a hard thing to communicate too, right? You want to be the guy that says, oh yeah, we've decided your neighborhood is one that's not worth saving. Yeah, I mean, well, look, I mean, and it's legitimate, right? So I'm not an expert on New Orleans, but based on my profound study post-Katrina, would I have rebuilt the lower Ninth Ward? No, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, it's like a disaster waiting to happen. Okay, except for the people who live there, yeah, they sort of have a different view.
Okay, let's say, oh, go ahead, Michael.
Comments on these two things. One, so if we, to get back to some of the ideas about complexity, so you gave the garbage example, and one of the things that struck me was, I know in Chicago, for instance, now they have meters that check the garbage levels on the cans through the city, and they only pick them up when they're full. So they know we've got a sporting event or we've got a concert, so we better get the trucks there on Tuesday morning because they're going to fill up from the concert the night before. And so now they do this. Now I know that doesn't solve the problem of residential pickup, but we can start to rethink the way we're doing some of these systems. So now Chicago and Evanston and several of the surrounding suburbs are running their trucks differently based on what their garbage cans are telling them. So I mean, this is a different approach to the problem. And
Smart trash technology.
yes, right, exactly.
That's a great thing. So they always have these things say, someday, you know, your toaster will be on the internet. And I'm
Right.
like,
Why do I want
why?
to
There's an answer, like why your garbage can should be online.
So, and I think this example, which may or may not be trivial, I don't know how much they save by doing this, or if they even pay for the cost of the monitoring system. I have no idea. But this gets back to Chuck's notion of framing the issue, and I think that particularly in issues of sustainability, it appears that many times we, as whether from the environmentalists or from agencies that are trying to resolve these problems, the framing starts out with this pessimistic, the world is going to hell in a handbasket approach, and it's quite easy to do given the scale and the nature of the problems that we're dealing with, and the fact that we're having this thing and how do we communicate complexity, and we're talking about how people don't think with nonlinearities, and the examples that Jonathan just gave about the logical answer if you were starting from a blank slate, and the role of power that gets into why things happen a certain way, and we can talk about the role of corporations and on and on and on. These things make us feel quite pessimistic, but we can also look at a lot of successes and things that have gotten better, and not to take a Pollyannish view of the world and think that everything's rosy, but in a lot of my own work, I look at why people, rather than why people are in conflict, why they're collaborating and working together. And we see a lot of instances where government is engaging with broader stakeholder groups, where they're bringing different points of view together, and how this is working in practice and resolving issues and bringing people together. Maybe they don't agree at the end of the day, but they've found some common understanding, and so on. And I can give some examples of that as we go forward.
I'm going to hold questions for a moment, and then we'll come back to the audience in a minute. I want to have the second round of panel comments on the strategy. So the idea now is, well, what specific techniques are available for communicating sustainability and complexity for public policy? And I bring this up partially because throughout the rest of the semester, the subsequent water climate briefings will be exploring in depth some of these specific techniques. And so what we're actually looking for is information from the audience as well as from the panel to flesh out and fill out what those subsequent briefings will detail. And so we'd actually like to hear your interest level in these different possible techniques, and even recommendations for specific speakers or people who would be good panelists to talk about these things. And so let me just throw out a few, and then the panel can discuss their points of view. So these might include new approaches to planning, like scenario planning, collaborative workshops, policy informatics, improved verbal communication techniques, new visualizations, or other new technologies. So what kinds of technologies or specific strategies are being used to communicate things like complexity and uncertainty, and how can we use those new approaches to overcome the challenges that we've discussed up until this point? And I'll open it up to anyone on the panel who wants to start.
Well, I feel like since the decision theater is right there, I think we should give at least a nod of the cap to the idea that visualizing things can be a useful way to. And I think to some degree we overpromise on that. I can't believe I'm going to say this in the temple of it. We overpromise a little bit on visualization, right? So visualization, I think that people often think about visualization as providing the answer. It doesn't provide the answer. It doesn't provide a solution when a solution is not readily apparent. But it does make it possible to have certain conversations that are harder to have in the absence of the visual cue of looking at something right there. So the example I always use, so how many people in here have seen the water sim thing? Most people, right there. So the example I always give on that is the toilets thing. Like, what if, right, so there's the thing, we all can visualize it, right? The upper right-hand corner, there's the thing, what if everybody had a low-flow toilet, right? And you see that the arrow moves like that. It makes no difference, right? Basically, if that model, now we can talk about whether it's right or not, and that's a different question, but basically it shows that no human behavioral thing makes any difference except having a swimming pool, right? So all you have to do is convince people in Arizona not to have swimming pools, and you're going to make a big impact on water consumption. So I think that's useful, right? Because it takes a lot of the noise out of the conversation. So we obviously have to think about something beyond, teaching little Timmy not to, have this faucet going when he's brushing his teeth, because quite frankly, that's not the answer. So I think that the visualization can be helpful in that regard to create a different conversation. So I think there's some possibility.
Well, and I should say one of the reasons that we're having this conversation is because we are actually in the process of creating an entirely new set of visualizations and user interfaces for the WaterSim model. And so that's partly driving our conversation, because we're trying to learn from the community, both the community stakeholders as well as other research scientists and educators and students, what are the most impactful, powerful, meaningful, salient kinds of visualizations to use when communicating things like model analysis and simulations and such. So that's partially driving this conversation. So. But it's always interesting to hear also from people who participate in decision theater sessions with WaterSim, what it is that they come away with, right? What is that nugget that they leave from that interaction with? And it's interesting. John and I hadn't talked about that previously, but so that's the first time I've heard him think about, well, it's the swimming pools, and some of Pat's research, previous research has focused in on the impact of swimming pools along with other outdoor residential landscaping decisions as being key drivers for at least the residential component of water use. So, Doug.
Yeah, the East Valley Water Forum, which was formed a number of years ago, partnered with the DCDC decision theater to build a groundwater model, visualize a groundwater model. And after it was all done, we took our city management in with a couple key council members, and we showed them the decision theater. And so I had all my notes up. I was ready for this. And as soon as we're done with the simulation, the council member turns to me and says, "Okay, I get it." Like, what? You get it? You understand how she understood how all the water flew and flowed, and all the interactions on the groundwater. And then she started asking the other questions, which I wasn't prepared for, on the interlinking of, okay, so if we do this and it affects this entity out here, what are they going to think? I was prepared to talk about the aquifer parameters and the depth of water and where the bedrock was, and she's asking questions like that I expected, years after the presentation, after it sunk in. But the point of that being is the visualization of a complex groundwater model system. The decision theater did an excellent job on that, and you know, it was 5 minutes in there, and it was, you know, it's
So
something
you're
like
saying
that.
that something about the model visualization actually communicated the complexity of the system to her in a way that generated new questions that
Correct.
you did not anticipate that she
Correct.
would ask.
Correct. And I think, you know, because when we get here, we try to explain things on 2D and graphs. That's a little bit more difficult. Or when you're talking, so the verbal is one way, but the actual immersion in the visual, because we got the glasses on, got to stand in there, and I mean, that was kind of cool. So you could look around and see everything. And that was a very good way of communicating the complex groundwater system.
So other comments from the panel about tools or techniques for communicating complexity and sustainability more broadly in these kinds of systems to policymakers and decision makers. What other techniques are available?
I'd like to make just one comment in terms of what the school sustainability is doing to communicate these issues to our future decision makers and leaders. And that's a series of classes that's trying to parse out some of the skill sets or competencies that are needed in our students and to help our students be able to articulate these to future employers. So struggling with the issue of what it means to have a degree in sustainability versus a degree in accounting, where people know what an accountant does and how they do it, and what does that mean for somebody coming into sustainability. But it's getting to these issues and setting them up with courses on systems thinking, on future thinking and scenario planning and building, and modeling courses and the like, to begin to develop skills and ways of thinking that are a bit outside what probably most of us in this classroom grew up learning in the ways of thinking that we had. And same, there are some different approaches, and frankly, we need different approaches to do this. And so I think that's getting there. It's a step in the right direction.
Okay, well maybe I'll open it back up to the audience and say both comments in terms of what do you think are the most promising techniques for communicating complexity for decision making, as well as recommendations for specific panelists as we explore this topic further, and just questions about anything that we've talked about. I want to come back and see if your question is still valid, if you want to ask another one now.
Well, you're kind of on the same track of what I was going to ask. Part of it is looking at it differently at the different levels of decision making. You know, your tools are different when you're talking to the practitioner, the advisor, the city manager in Doug's case, the mayor,
Right.
And how you might be able to convey these concepts you're trying to basically teach.
Yeah, can either you or you all answer that for us? Because that's one of the greatest challenges we're facing, for instance, in the redesign of the WaterSim model, is to be able to have both an interface and a set of visual output products that are relevant for different communities, right? For everything from 8th graders, right, who are just learning about the water system, and we're trying to help them to understand the complexity of the water system in a way that's meaningful to them, to the water resource managers or even city council members, where you're using the same underlying power of a complex systems model, right, but producing different products that are relevant or meaningful for those different audiences. So I'd like to have the answer to that question.
So I'll maybe rephrase it a little bit. In some of my own work in conservation in national parks, we saw people moving to adapt this way of thinking and taking adaptive management approaches, where they would try something, experiment, collect data, see if it was working. If it wasn't working, they would change it. So we think this is our best option, and we'll see how it works. And if it's doing what we think it's doing, if it's directionally correct, we can tweak it, but we know we're on the right path. And so they try something. If it fails, then they try something different. And this can work really great at that level. But the problem is, as we scale it up, and now you have a policymaker, and you're supposed to have the politicians stand there and say, okay, we're going to try this, and if it doesn't work, well, we'll just try something else. That doesn't go over very well. So as we move from say, in the bureaucracy into the mayor's office or something, that then they're stuck with the need to be binary, as came out earlier.
So I was just thinking, I think it has to be parsed in another way at the same time. So I was thinking the same thing. That's, what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about communicating? Communicating to the city manager, communicating to Joe Voter, communicating who exactly? So I also think communicating is a kind of broad word, right? So it seems to me there's a very different sort of set of considerations if you think you know the answer and you're trying to teach, right? So we sort of know how the aquifer works, and I've seen that presentation. It's more or less explaining how it works. And so what's great about the visualization is it just accelerates that learning process dramatically. So that's different than when you're trying to foster some sort of different interaction around a decision-making process. And so then the question is, okay, so then let's just assume that those are the only two modes of communication. I don't think it is. But so then, for whom, right? So the water thing that I'm familiar with was having a bunch of water district managers together. There were some people who were more general, but it was people who kind of knew something about water, talking about the watershed and everything like that, which would be really, you wouldn't have had the same conversation if you just got citizen councils, right? So it seems to me that you do have to have some sort of adaptation, depending upon both the objective and the thing. The other thing I would say, and you might also hint at this, I don't think we know. I think there is a generational problem here, right? Which is, I think that some of the technologies that are out there are there. So we're having a discussion. It's actually relevant to this conversation. So for the freshmen in the college book programs, we gave them a group book to read. So they're all reading World War Z, which, by the way, is exactly this conversation. World War Z is, what if the world was taken over by zombies? It's just a metaphor for big public goods problems. That's all. It's exactly this. I mean, it's not. You could argue it's sort of ham-handed, but that's what it's about. And so they're going to have so I said, well, is there like a book discussion group that I can lead or something like that? Oh yes, this is great. It's great. It's on Twitter. I don't know how to do that. How do I lead a discussion? I don't know how to lead it. I mean, I guess I could figure it out, obviously, but it would be awkward. But so maybe there's technological solutions about Twitter conversations or ways of dispersing information and engaging people that are different, that are less hierarchical, right? Because I think that's part of the issue, right? That may create opportunities to have better exchange around these things.
I'm going to go, Charles had a question, and then I'll go over here. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
Oh, my name's Bill.
Bill, sorry.
But I just would follow up with the gentleman in front of me. I think it seems to me it depends on who you're communicating, who the communication is between. It's one thing for the water departments to communicate with the mayor or the council, but it's another thing to communicate to the public at large. And I think communicating complexity through the mass media is something that addresses or needs to be addressed in the context of this discussion. We were talking about Fukushima and these big issues. Most people learn about those things through what they read in the paper or hear on television or get through their handheld device. Mm-hmm. And so it would seem to me that as you go forward with this discussion, maybe having somebody from, I don't know, School of Journalism, somebody who deals with this bigger issue to be part of this conversation.
Are there any examples from your experience where you think that this has been done effectively? Particularly, any media coverage of a complex issue, whether it was Deepwater Horizon or Fukushima or something, where you felt or anyone felt that a particular media outlet did an excellent job of covering the issue and communicating the complexity to a public audience? Frontline, perhaps, yeah. New York Times, NPR. I mean, there are some media outlets that go in depth, but those are also they tend to be in depth, right?
Well, the other thing is, my experience with that is the New York Times is great unless it's an article that's about something you know a lot about. right? So this is my favorite. It's like the cognitive dissonance with which we read the New York Times is really something, right? So we read something that we're experts in, and we're like, this is idiotic. They've gotten it all wrong, and then like, oh, look what's happening in the Congo. I guess we've done it. And right, I mean, so it's probably all wrong, right? I mean, just probabilistically. By the way, I think the idea of bringing in people from communications is a great idea. It's a great idea.
No, I do, and I think that there are a variety of groups around campus that focus on science writing, and I think that's something that we've actually been working a little bit more aggressively toward. I'll give a preview of coming attractions. We're going to be releasing 2 white papers, policy briefs. One focused on water reuse that is a result of a collaboration we had with Intel and with CH2M Hill that focuses on water reuse in the state of Arizona. And that's specifically directed at a broader audience, not at a narrow technical audience. And we're working with the Global Institute of Sustainability and their communications group to create a product that's a little more accessible and visually pleasing, a little glossier. And we have a second such report that'll be coming out that's focused kind of on a synthesis of all of that Kelly Larson has led. It's a synthesis of all the different research that we've done over the last 10 years, almost 10 years at DCDC. And so we're trying to get, it's not quite to the mass media that level that you're talking about, but I think partnering with the Morrison Institute, like we've done in the past on the Watering the Sun Corridor report, is another way to try and get the results of our work out. But I think the mass media is a big missing area. Over here, and then I'll come back to the front here.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Richardson. I'm concerned a little that our discussion's all been about communicating as if it's always top down.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see in working with the public, and I work as an architect and urban planner, is that, you know, if we don't have a citizenry that is engaged and wants the conversation, we can Twitter all we want. We've got scenario planning. We've got great ways of putting it out there. So, and a recent example is with the general plan. And every city's taking this around all over the place. And you can go out and maybe have 5 people in it. You have it online, and I've been watching this to see how many people are responding and how many are just watching, but there might be 3 comments out of the whole city. So no matter how much we put things out there, if we want change, and I see a lot of places, especially with the sustainability model, where we do want change, the citizens have to raise that to an issue and communicate with council people. And the council are, because they have the power doesn't mean they have the knowledge. They're generalists versus specialists. So they're kind of at the same place as our citizens are. They may not know all the ins and outs, and we have to address the complexity, but if there's no desire, we're still not getting
Well, that's what I was saying.
So
I think most people just don't. I mean, just being frank about it. I mean, most people just don't care. They don't. It's a combination of not caring, having too much going on in their lives, and not wanting, and making a triage decision, right? And then there's this collective action problem, which is my voice saying I think we should do something about energy isn't going, or the environment or whatever. You know, that's not a good use of my time. And I just think that's the reality. That's why I say when we talk about communicate, there's more information available to citizens today than ever before, and it's more easily accessible. You know, you can download databases, you can get all these documents. You used to have to go and photocopy this stuff in the library. I mean, you can get anything now, almost instantaneously. It's remarkable. But most people are not. Most people are not engaged.
Let me get Arnim's comment, and then I'll come back here because I know you've been involved in a variety of participatory processes with the city planning efforts in Phoenix and other places. So.
Arnim Wick from the School of Sustainability. So I completely agree. Obviously, it's a major challenge to get people involved. We have seen this in the general plan update now over years with the city of Phoenix, with the Reinvent Phoenix grant, very similar aspects, challenges. In fact, but we need to be smarter. I'm with Mike. I mean, we can look into where we are failing, but we need to be smarter in getting to the people who are interested. And they might not be interested in coming to your meeting, but you need to go to their meeting. Right. And we had actually good successes, in particular in Reinvent Phoenix, where we did these kind of satellite events. So don't design your own event. Bring, 5 people out and the usual suspects anyway, right? So they're coming all the time. You know what they already say.
I was going to say 3 of those comments were from one person.
And that I knew.
With my mom. If you go where people are, and in particular, looking into, reading the landscape of different groups and stakeholder interests, right? You can actually plug in various forms, and even if it's sports events or school events, we have actually had quite some success in research. One other thing I think we need to do, is Mike said it as well, is go to the people who care. And who cares? Children do. Young people care, actually. And we had amazing, actually, success in working with schools and trying to build the kind of citizens we would like to, see, being engaged, trying to think about the future, actually grappling with ideas of complexity, at a very early stage. And so I think the idea of we communicate and we try to always adapt to the people we want to talk to has its limits, right? I mean, this kind of targeted communication is in general a good idea, but at the same time using communication for capacity building. Not only, conveying information, you need to know the complexities I know about the water system, but rather saying, we want to really build your capacity. And that usually starts probably at a very early stage.
She's been holding a question right here.
Well, it was more of a comment on earlier when we were talking about different media, looking at different media sources. And I was thinking how interesting it is to, when some big event happens, to see the response on my Facebook feed. Like everybody in my life coming from a different background, different educational background, and how they report it, how they respond to it, just to see their perception. And it kind of plays into what they're saying about how we need some sort of way to gauge the public and engage the public and to gauge where the public stands on our perceptions, our interests, and our readiness to respond with certain solutions to change how we do things, to respond to complex issues. I'm not saying Facebook, but I'm saying,
No, but I do think, and could you remind us of your name so people know?
I'm Kristen Whitney from the School of Earth and Space Exploration.
Thank you, Kristen. But I do think there are real opportunities particularly for graduate students and younger investigators to look at data analytics for social media. I mean, I think this is an opportunity where there is actually a conversation going on about a lot of these issues. And it may be in 140 characters or less, but there's a lot of it out there.
But I think it's an extension of Arm's point, because that's where the conversation is happening, right? It's not happening at at some school auditorium at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night. It's happening on Facebook.
Many people don't know about an issue until they see it on Facebook.
Right, and there is a tremendous wealth of information on public attitudes and perspectives on those issues to be gleaned. And there are folks at ASU and other universities that are doing analytics on. I mean, there's this big drive towards what's known as big data within the science field. Mostly people think of that in terms of remote sensing, satellite images, and all the data that's coming. But from the social science perspective, there's this big data that's being constantly generated out there, and of course the NSA has figured that out.
No, but there was the thing with people. I'm sure there's probably a dozen people who know more about this than I, but where you can figure out disease outbreaks by people Googling cold symptoms, right? So I think the same thing would be possibly, where is there opportunities for engagement on sustainability issues? Well, look where people are talking about it.
Yeah, if you haven't seen that Google Trends on flu epidemics, it's fascinating. Cool. I mean, you can people searching for clinics and other flu-related issues. They'll show you a visual map broken down to by your small area. You can see where the flu breaks epidemiologically. You can see the flu breaks right as they're happening.
Shay Shutters with the Center for Social Dynamics, Complexity, and also School Sustainability. So a lot of the job that I do is exactly what you're trying to do: communicate complexity science to policymakers. And
I work mostly in the Phoenix area with higher level city decision makers. And the biggest obstacle I've encountered is what I guess I would call the baseball problem. And that is where a policymaker says, look, you're a scientist, I'm going to throw a baseball. You're going to come up with a really cool set of differential equations and take into consideration curvature and resistance and dynamics and all this thing, and you're going to be pretty accurate. But a 10-year-old will go out there and catch the ball every time. And so what they're saying to me is that you get some, and they've actually said this quote, you've got some pretty cute tools. You get big data, graphs, dynamics. Nothing that you show me will replace my experience, intuition, and heuristics. That's why I was hired, and the vast percentage of the time, I will be more accurate than whatever it is you're trying to show me that I don't have time for. And in some ways, they're right, I'm finding. But I'm wondering if you've encountered that and how you deal with it. And I could tell you a little bit of my experience of how I've dealt with it, if you're interested.
That's a really good, I mean, our colleague Grady Gamage, who we work with on a variety of these issues, was participating in a panel discussion we had that was looking at scenario planning for the future of agriculture in the state, and he used that specific, he said, this is cute. And he said quaint as well in the follow-up, but we actually convinced him to jump on board with that work. Marco, did you want to comment on that specifically, and then we'll go to the panel?
Yeah, so there is a great book by a German Dietrich Dörner, The Logic of Failure. And so they test how people are able to manage complex systems, and typically it's not because people are smart, but because they have experience. And so one of the challenges is that we should not necessarily tell people what to do, but they have to find ways that they can experience this. And so that's, we experienced this when doing field experiments, that we have noticed that this lead to changes in communities where we have done experiments. And so we are now testing whether doing experiments in villages in India, where typically the NGOs come to talk about water budgets, and that doesn't really make a change, but whether we do a groundwater game, whether we can measure that will lead to behavioral change. And at least from the debriefings, this may happen, but that's also related to education. People have to experience this, not necessarily read about it. And I think that's because a lot of the kind of catching the ball, it's something you have to experience that, and it's probably an innovation we need to develop in learning, in education, about how to teach this kind of complexity in different ways than the traditional ways.
I think those are two really important points. The part about insight and experience. We conducted a study where we were looking at how water decision makers make their decisions, and one of the important findings was that there was a tremendous amount of reliance on professional judgment and personal experience and insight, combined with the integration of the more technical and scientific knowledge that they evaluated in light of all those other experiences, and also the idea about having people experience complexity as a way to help to learn how to communicate with them. We have just one time for just a last sort of final thoughts from the panelists, and then we'll conclude. So if you want to just make any concluding remarks and any ideas you have about opportunities for moving forward for collaborations that you've identified throughout this discussion, and then we'll wrap up. And I apologize if I didn't get to all of your questions.
Well, let me just mention one other ASU thing, because it's good to make people aware of it. So Marco's point about games, I think, is a natural one. So there's something called the Center for Games and Impact, and I don't know how many people have met Sasha Barab and Alan Lerner. What is it? No, that's not it. Anyway, is that Gershenfeld? Yeah. No,
always trust Billy. He usually knows.
Anyways, but that's a really cool. It's a really cool thing. It's part of the Mary Lou Fulton Education School, but it's about using games as educational tools, and exactly the same premise, which is by getting them to engage, you actually create a different kind of learning than hearing a lecture on numbers. The other thing that I was thinking, as several people were talking, I think that one problem we have is, you were talking, one of the things you were talking about is how do we as academics fail in terms of communicating. So one thing I think we fail is that we talk about data and we try to present a sort of rational, quantitative presentation, when in fact it's the narrative stories that resonate, which is another way of giving people experience, right? It's this vicarious experience, and I think part of what we could do better is to reduce our presentations to compelling stories that are more accessible than the coefficients which we think give us credibility and power, but to most people it's a nice toy. And so, so I think that may be one of the lessons for us. We need to, we do tend to do what everybody does, which is we try to figure out what's wrong with these people, why are they not understanding us, and think a little bit about why are we communicating so badly. I think that might be part of it, is we're not communicating how human beings communicate.
Final comments, Doug?
No, I just look forward to listening and learning how we can communicate better with the public and our managers.
I guess I'll just end with an anecdote similar to the concluding of this session, and this is a story of my grandfather. My grandfather's a farmer and has been for 70 years and has a 4th grade education, and he's always talking to me about going off to school, and he thought it was crazy when I went for a master's degree, let alone a PhD, and he told me this story, and ag economist came out to the farm, and my grandfather was showing him around, and the ag economist kept going around and saying, "This is really outdated, the way you're doing this. This is really, old-fashioned. It's not the latest, and this is bad, and this is bad." And throughout the entire day, everything is poorly designed, poorly run. This. And my father is just kind of nodding his head and listening to this. And at the end of the day, he says, "Look at this apple tree. I bet you don't get a bushel of apples from it." And my grandfather says, "I reckon you're right. That's a pear tree."
Okay, well, please join me in thanking our panelists for their... Final comments: if you have not signed up for the mailing list, please do so you'll get notifications of future events. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next Water Climate Briefing in October. Okay, thank you. Programs, and is highly adaptive, responsive to critiques and suggestions of past reviews. And I share that with you just as a way of thanking the DCDC faculty, staff, and graduate students, and also our stakeholder and community partners, because it's really the work that you all have done that contributes to the success of the organization, and we really appreciate that, those contributions. And many of you in this room are the reason that we've been successful in that regard. So today we're going to kick off our series for the year, and we're going to start with the discussion of the idea of challenges of communicating sustainability in complex systems for public policy. And this is the topic that we will be exploring in depth throughout a series of 6 to 9 of these meetings this academic year. And we're starting off with a panel that includes Jonathan Cabell, who is the Dean of the College of Public Programs, and also the Laddie and Elbacor Presidential Chair from the School of Public Affairs at ASU. And Jonathan is also my dean, and that's for my boss's boss. Right? Next, we also have Michael Schoon. Michael is Assistant Professor in Environmental Policy in the School of Sustainability here at ASU, and also works with a group focused on complex adaptive systems, which you'll hear about today. And third, we have Doug Toy, and Doug is the Water Regulatory Affairs Manager for the City of Chandler, and Doug has been one of our regular collaborators and partners on a variety of projects here at DCDC. And so the format of the panel today is just going to be, we're going to have some initial comments where I've asked the panelists...
Approach to science. This draws on the other two definitions of complexity, but this holistic approach, an interdisciplinary approach to the major challenges confronting us as society, and some of the big challenges are that we're looking at systems, complex adaptive systems, where there's no silver bullets. There's a lot of wicked problems, if we're familiar with that terminology, where there's no simple solution. There's different points of view, different worldviews of the problems, and we're trying to make sense of that in systems where there are nonlinearities, where the system doesn't just continue to go incrementally, but we're trying to struggle with and comprehend these nonlinearities and thresholds where things radically change in a moment's notice, and we're trying to deal with what happens now that the system is the way it is. And so if we think about things like climate change, for instance, if we're approaching thresholds, how do we know we're approaching a threshold? What happens once we cross that threshold? And how do we go about studying this and understanding this and moving from a reductionist approach to science to this more holistic view and trying to understand that?
I was going to ask if you could just give some, so you mentioned climate change. What are some other examples of these kinds of wicked problems that have been discussed in the literature where complexity is a major component of the problem?
So anytime we bring the economy into the equation, it seems that we're adding as well as the provision of public goods. Talking about complexity and sustainability and communicating that, the first thing that struck me is that I hope that I'm not demonstrating how not to do it, because it's a bit of a daunting task. So bear with me, please.
That could have been your big reveal at the end.
Yeah, right. So now that you've seen how I do it, please listen to what I say, not what I do. So I thought we'd start more about me, or do you want me to talk about?
Why don't you start a little bit with your background and then move into?
Sure. So I focus on institutional analysis and see myself as a social ecological scientist rather than as a political scientist or something else. And I'll bring this up again and again, the idea of interdisciplinarity and what that means for complexity and what that means for sustainability and the issues that we're confronting and trying to solve as scientists. So I thought first talking about a few different ways that I see people using the word complexity and how it's being used here at ASU. One way is in common parlance, this is really complex, and using it as a metaphor for something that's a big challenge, a big problem, as the first way. The second is this is a new methodological approach or set of methodological approaches to these challenges that we're facing using computation and modeling approaches to science. And the third, and the one that I'd like to focus on a little bit more, is this holistic approach.
To tell you a little bit about themselves, a little bit about the work that they've done in their respective area of expertise, and then address a couple key questions in terms of what are the major insights, what are the major findings from either their field of academic research or from their experience as a practitioner in facing the challenge of complexity and issues related to sustainability, and how we communicate those issues to public policy and other decision makers for incorporation into their decision making, and also how those communities, decision makers and public policy representatives, communicate the complexity and issues that they deal with to the academy so that we can incorporate those into our research. So what are the big challenges that we face in dealing with complexity and communicating that? And then in the second part of the talk, we'll address new and innovative approaches for communicating complexity in systems for public policy. And so I'm going to start by asking Michael Schoen to summarize his expertise and experience. Once we go through the panel, each having about 7-10 minutes to talk individually, I'll open it up for questions, and we'd like to hear from many of you in terms of your experiences facing these challenges. And then we'll do a second round of questions and then more discussions. Okay? So once again, thank you everyone for coming, and I'd like to introduce Michael Schoen.
Hi everybody. My research is in complexity and sustainability and resilience, predominantly through environmental policy and looking at the appropriation of natural resources and how do we manage that appropriation.
My name is Dave White, and I'm the PI and co-director for Decision Center for Desert City. and I'd like to welcome you to our inaugural water climate briefing for this academic year. It's great to see so many folks attend. We had something like 75 RSVPs for this event, and so it's really encouraging, and I think that that's probably a reflection of our outstanding panel that we have. So I'd like to begin and just kind of give you, since it's the first time I've seen many of you in a couple months, I'd like to give you a little update on some of the recent accomplishments from the center and the participants. The most important is that since we've last seen many of you, DCDC completed a major milestone in that we had a successful midterm site review by the National Science Foundation. So NSF provided a review with an external committee of advisors, and DCDC emerged from that successfully. And the committee said, I just want to read you a quote, that DCDC has developed an extensive and high-quality program that combines new research on social science elements of decision-making under uncertainty with direct stakeholder involvement. The programs have a well-defined vision and mission, and the research carried out under DCDC is consistent with its mission. The group has developed a tool of considerable value to practitioners and educators alike in WaterSim, and the group has developed high-quality education and outreach programs